There are a lot of surprises that happen here during the course of colloquiums. And one of our big surprises is that we're going to be honored with some music from the Eastern Medicine Singers. This is incredibly impromptu, but I think it's a wonderful way to start our program on Native in New England. I would also like to say that after the singers are finished, you will be joined by Lorraine Spears, who is the executive director of the Tomaquag Museum in Exeter, Rhode Island, and she will at that time introduce our speakers. Thank you.
haven't been sung in almost probably 50 years. And we started doing this about, like I said, a year ago. And what it is the sound of the East Coast, we call it, the Eastern Woodland people. Here's a song that our sister wrote for us. And we're going to have this for you at this time.
Thank you, Easton Medicine. We appreciate it. It gives us a beautiful feeling this evening as we think about natives in New England. So we appreciate that. The gentleman here, if you would, as you go by, could you just say your name and what nation you're from? Because I know that's an intertribal drum there, and people might not realize that where in New England or where you're from.
David Littletree, Iroquois.
Raymond Watson, Narragansett.
Spirit Wolf from the Arawak Nation.
I'm called Greywater. I'm from the Pokanoket Wampanoag Federation.
Mervyn Johnson, Narragansett.
I'm Marty Crippen. I'm Chillicothe and Montauk. Oh.
This evening, as we learn about natives in New England, we are going to have 3 speakers, and they are going to be Julianne Jennings, Paulla Dove Jennings, and Wanda Jean Lord. And they're going to come up and join us on the stage at this time. Our first speaker this evening is going to be talking about the New England Indian slave trade, and that's Julianne Jennings, and she is, oh goodness, you got me on this one. I don't know how to say your tribe's name.
Nottoway, Cheroenhaka.
Nottoway Cheroenhaka, artist and educator. For over 15 years, Ms. Jennings has been teaching children and adults about the history and culture of the Native people in southern New England. Her work has been supported by Rhode Island Committee for the Humanities, the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts, the Rhode Island Foundation, Half and Wrapper Museum of Anthropology, which is part of Brown University, Rhode Island School of Design, and many others. Ms. Jennings served as an associate professor, Rhode Island location, for the Emmy Award-winning PBS documentary called Mystic Voices, The Story of the Pequot War, co-produced by Wilton Woods Productions and Sasko Creek Productions in 2005, where Ms. Jennings wrote and performed several original songs in the lost language of the Massachusetts, Narragansett, and Pequot, as well as portrayed the character Wynencombon, a prominent 17th century Pequot woman. She is the author of several books and journal articles on native southern New England and has recently co-authored a book entitled A Cultural History of the Native People of Southern New England. In 2007, she received Eve Ensler's Vagina Warrior Award presented by Rhode Island College for her outstanding advocacy against violence and sexual assault against Native American women. In 2008, Ms. Jennings became Rhode Island College's first Native American to graduate with a Master's of Arts degree in Anthropology. As an undergraduate major, she distinguished herself with the department's James Houston Award in Anthropology, the first Native American recipient to receive this distinguished award from Rhode Island College. In 2009, she received special congressional recognition from the United States Senate for her outstanding achievements in cultural enrichment as part of the Extraordinary Woman Award event. Currently, Ms. Jennings is an adjunct professor at Pima Community College in Tucson, Arizona, and continues to work towards her Ph.D. in anthropology. I'd like to welcome Julianne Jennings.
Good evening. I put together this PowerPoint presentation as a result of my experiences as a Native American person here in southern New England. There are going to be two threads running through this PowerPoint presentation. One is a historical overview that really led us to this point in time. Two, it will be intertwined with voices from Native American contemporaries here in southern New England. One of the most important aspects in telling the backstory is that it legitimizes the struggle and the persistence of New England Indians here in southern New England. More importantly, it allows us to have opportunity to read that backstory and critically think about the things that had happened here and to have a better understanding of the people that exist here today. So with that, let me begin. When we talked earlier about surprises, the car got towed. The PowerPoint that I wanted to present, well, that kind of got towed with it, but I think we'll manage. Okay, there's going to be some text in here, but we'll get through it together. When we talk about that backstory, it's not a place where I want to continue to maintain a polarization of the peoples. We need to find a place that we can come together on this world stage and begin to truly understand who we are as a people. And I found this quote by Walter Mignolo, where he says, "Borderlands, contrary to frontiers, are no longer the lines where civilization and barbarism meet and divide, but the location where a new consciousness emerges." And that's where I want to take this, okay? A place where we can actually just come together and maybe find a point of resolution and go from there. The story is getting very old, and I really want to move us forward into the 21st century with the way we should think about each other and Native Americans in southern New England. I began with this clip of Troy Phillips, who was also in the movie We Shall Remain, and he says, "To me, being a New England Indian, it means 400 years of survival for my Nipmuc community. We've survived plagues, wars, slavery, and still managed to share our culture and ancestors' way of life to all those who walk on this great turtle island. Nothing was lost, it was taken, but we persevered. Our sacred fires still burn, our language is in recovery, and our teachings are growing as our stories are shared. We are a strong people." Now you see this one image of Troy dressed up as this fine warrior, proud of who he is, but I thought it was equally important to share with you this image of Troy as a father and his children, and protecting what needs to be taught to his children, and yet also to those children that may come along down the way. Okay. So now we need to set down the roots of inequality, which began the ranking of races from order to chaos. During the Enlightenment period, the backdrop for 18th century European theories about human differences need to be addressed here. Exploration of Africa, Asia, and the Americas brought Europeans into contact with people who they found quite different. Because skin color was so noticeable, it was the most frequently explained trait, and most systems of racial classification became based on these explanations. Race would then later become a classifier and ranking of human beings according to inferior and superior types. Although race is a construct developed in the West, it eventually spread to many parts of the non-Western world through international commerce and the slave trade. And these ideas are still with us today. So we need to take a further look at this great chain of being. It laid down the ideal of racial superiority. So this prominent colonial theory of race was the great chain of being, the idea that human races could be lined up from most superior to most inferior. The chain starts from God and progresses downward to angels, demons, fallen angels, such as renegade angels, stars, moons, the king, who laid the order of top of humanity's social order through the doctrine of the divine right of kings, princes, nobles, men, wild animals, domesticated animals, trees, other plants, precious stones, precious metals, minerals, and then an arrangement of non-white people with blacks at the bottom. There is no mention of Indians. So when the Europeans came over here, this was just placed in their heads, and this was going to be the ranking and the way it was going to be enforced eventually through war. I'm taking a quantum leap through time, 1680s through the 1800s. We have this early classification of nature, and the most prominent enlightened thinkers were Carlos Linnaeus, Johann Blumenbach, Morgan, and Morton, among others. They greatly influenced European ideas about economics, government, and science. The framework of Enlightenment philosophy in Europe was a belief and reason and rationale that provided an authoritative system of ethics, aesthetics, values, and knowledge. One of the first efforts by Europeans to document human variation began with French physician Francois Bernier in his published work in 1684, A New Division of the Earth according to the different species of races of men who inhabited it. Bernier relied on categories based on outward physical characteristics such as skin color. Now, I was just talking to a group and I asked them what is black, and we now know from that discussion that race is truly an illusion. Okay, so here is his classical classification of humans into distinct races based on skin color. We have in 1735 Carlos Linnaeus, who published the first edition of Systema Naturae, which detailed his biological classification system of all living things. Linnaeus formalized the distinction among the continental populations of the world, and his work helped categorize the concept of race. Linnaeus proposed 4 subcategories of Homo sapiens: Americanus, Asiatics, Africanus, and Europeans. Linnaeus also believed that each race had certain endemic characteristics or temperament types. His work is the first to mention Native Americans as choleric or red, straightforward, eager, and combative. I don't think anybody here in this room is red. That's Native American. Africans were phlegmatic, black, slow, relaxed, negligent. Asians were melancholic, yellow, inflexible, severe, voracious. But Europeans walked away with the best of the best. They were sanguine, they were optimistic, hopeful, and confident, pale, muscular, swift, clever, and inventive. So, sure. Then we jump forward with Walter Ashby Plecker. We wouldn't be having this conversation if this were true, right? Walter Ashby Plecker, the first registrar of Virginia Bureaus of Vital Statistics, starting in 1912, started to force Indians to classify themselves as black on birth and marriage and death certificates. So here we are, moving into the 20th, 21st century, and this is still happening. Understand, too, during colonial Rhode Island, reclassification of Indians, in particular Narragansetts, was also taking place. These tribes, he said, had become a mongrel mixture, and for the next 35 years, he led the effort to purify the white race in Virginia by supporting the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, which created two racial categories, white and everybody else. We still fill out the census records, of our race, and it looks so wonderful. They have these multi-racial boxes saying, oh, hey, they're recognizing Latinos, and look, they're recognizing now the new term or an old term Negro and whatever else in between. But truly, it just polarizes the races. It says white and then everybody else, okay? So it's still happening, and we still just line up to that beat. Then there's the one-drop rule, a legalized form of discrimination, if you ask me. The one-drop rule, unique to America's binary folk culture of race relations, is tied to the colonial slave system and later Jim Crow segregation, was systematically employed to strip southern New England Indians of their identities. It decreed that a single drop of black blood, no matter how remote, or a single ancestor who was African, made an individual of mixed race black. Indians became classified as colored or Negro, and in some cases Caucasian or white, on census records and birth certificates. Cultural purity had been replaced with alleged blood purity to fulfill a social agenda of extermination. And oh gee, that seems like it happened so long ago. We'll get to that in a minute, but here's a wonderful face. This is Ray Watson, Narragansett, who is just on the drum. Beautiful image. Ella talks about the one-drop rule. Ella Sikatow from the Narragansett. She says the one-drop rule was used to deny our existence and allowed Europeans to claim what they had stolen. Ella was very influential in me putting together my master's thesis on the politics of identity for Native Americans. The late Richard Wilcox Narragansett also assisted me in my writing of my master's, and he said, if the one drop of black blood can define us as Negroes, it's apparent then that the strength of the African people can be determined in that one drop. Once the Europeans figured that out, they tried to whip that out of us too. And then here you go, hot cold evidence, 1961, I was born, and you can see Negro, I had it amended just in 2007. Negro is X'd out, and it says Native American. And this is still not right, because I am also black and white and Indian, but they're still forcing me to choose just one identity. Okay, my mother is Polish and Italian, my father's black and Indian, and it's not that I'm ashamed of who and what I am, because that's the history here in southern New England. It's a beautiful, rich, and wanting history to be told as to why there is so much diversity here, something we should be embracing, something that we should be applauding here in this region. Okay, something that you should not be felt ashamed of, but at least allow us the right to call us what we want to call us and how we wish to identify. That right was not given to us. Based on that one drop, I have 1/8 black blood. I was labeled Negro, and that's not the whole story. So I had to find out more. This is Michael Spirit Wolf Rass and Richard. I don't know Richard's last name, unfortunately, but I love his shirt. It just synthesizes the whole thought. Sure, you can trust the government, just ask an Indian. Right? Now slavery begins. So we're going to take a capsule summary of what slavery had done here in southern New England. First, before we get to these waters, we need to understand what was happening in Europe. And here we have, to all those who shall engage in war, complete forgiveness of all their sins. This is Pope Nicholas V, who put together 2 papal bulls, very important in the conquest, quote, of Native Americans. The first bull was the Dum Diversas, authorizing the right of conquest to Alfonso V of Portugal. who facilitated the Portuguese slave trade and allowed him to invade and search out, capture, and vanquish and subdue all Saracens, Arabs and Muslims, and pagans, and any enemies of Christ, Africans and Indians included. And then there was the Romanus Pontifex to the same Alfonso as a follow-up to the Dum Diversas. It extended to the Catholic nations of Europe, dominion over discovered lands during the Age of Discovery. So you had these two bulls, giving complete authority to come and take the land and take the people too. This is a legal piece that explains the doctrine of discovery further, and I'm not really going to get into it, but it really just basically says the same things. Take the lands from the heathens and the infantiles. The slave trade was so ferocious and so competitive between Spain and Portugal that the Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494, separated the two places here, Cape Verde Islands, already in the Portuguese hands, and those lands discovered by Columbus claimed for Spain. So basically the lands to the east would belong to Portugal and the lands to the west to Spain. So this is kind of the madness that's taking place. Then there was a need to finance the trade, and that was naturally to bring slaves to work on the sugar plantations off the coast of Europe and Africa, the Canary Islands, the Madeira, and so forth. Henry the Navigator became deeply entrenched in the trade as well, and Madeira sugar soon reached the markets in all the ports in Europe. In 1460, highly profitable sugar plantations were established on the Cape Verde Islands, and in 1490 on Sao Tome. Understand, here is the madness of the movement. Europe, taking slaves off bringing merchandise and so forth, and manufactures, ivory and so forth, to the west coast of Africa, picking up slaves, going to South America, taking slaves and gold, to, North America and so forth, the production of sugar to make molasses and into rum. It's really, really crazy, the exploitation that was taking place during these times. 4 centuries worth of slave trade, which really drove the wheel of capitalism. So by the time Columbus sailed to the Atlantic Ocean, he really knew what was going on. He eventually spread to Brazil, Haiti, and then Mexico, Cuba, Guadeloupe, and Martinique. So it was we were really heavily engaged. Columbus then lands into the Bahama Archipelago and meets the Taino, the good people. Tolok has this wonderful piece on the back of the 500 Nations dust jacket. When the first Europeans arrived, Columbus and his crew, he came and he sailed, and he called us Indians. Because of obvious reasons, he thought he was lost in India. But what did we call ourselves before Columbus came? That is the question so often asked. And the thing is, in every single tribe, even today, when you translate the word that we called each that we had for ourselves without knowledge of each other, it was always something that translated to basically the same thing. In our language, it's Ninook, or the people, or the human beings. That is what we called ourselves. So when the Pilgrims arrived here, we knew who we were, but we didn't know who they were. So we called them Awagisok, or the strangers, because they were the ones that didn't know. But we knew each other, and that we were the human beings. Oh, what happened here? Columbus, when he met the Taino, or the good people, he remarked in his captain's log of hospitality he and his men received. Columbus wantonly killed and enslaved the islanders under the installation system of the encomienda system, in which entire native villages were commended to individual colonists or groups of colonists to work in mines or in plantations for food, gold, and spun cotton. This forced labor system was equally brutal, to slavery. At least 1 million Indian children and adults perished to near extinction by 1550. Sexual slavery was also widespread among the Spanish settlers. And there's a nice little image there of them working in their island there, producing sugar. And here's another nice image. The conquest was a major point in the history of the Americas. It marked not only Columbus's violent victory over the people of the Bahamas, Cuba, and Hispaniola, but set in motion the medieval process of a new social edifice bringing conquered dominions into Christendom. Columbus's reign of terror would be replicated a half a century later by Cortez in Mexico, Pizarro in Peru, the expeditions of Ponce de Leon in 1513, Coronado in 1540, and De Soto. They launched similar crusades affecting the same pattern on the North American continent. The Spanish example was followed and further by the British, beginning at Roanoke in 1585, followed by Jamestown in 1607, and in Plymouth in 1620. Overall, the process of English colonization along the Atlantic coast was marked by enslavement and a series of massacres of native peoples as unyielding and as destructive as any perpetuated by the Spanish. But there's a little twist here. De las Casas, who was a Spanish priest, he was sympathetic to the plight of Indians and described the terrible violence against them. And he goes on and he says that they rode the backs of the Indians as if they were hungry. And they thought nothing of knifing Indians by 10s and 20s and of cutting slices of them to test the sharpness of their blades. The Bible recognized 3 races of humans after the Great Flood: the sons of Shem, Shemonites, or Asiatics, the sons of Ham, Africans, and the sons of Japheth, the Europeans. De las Casas argued that Indians, not mentioned in the Bible, have souls, and thus could be converted to Christianity. Therefore, they are human and not pre-Adamites. Although there's a lot of debate, too, in De las Casas' work. He did own slaves. He eventually freed them, but there's still much investigation that needs to be looked at in his work. Now here we are, here in southern New England, known as the Devil's Realm. The Europeans had this idea that if they could not tame it, it would tame them. Dr. Frank O'Brien, Abenaki, states, "Thou shalt not kill" does not mean it was okay to kill Indians because they were not white or did not follow the Christian faith. "Thou shalt not steal" does not mean it was okay to steal an Indian's land. The English, who did not live in accordance with these teachings, insulted the will of God. They have been dealt with in the religion of their faith. Have the souls of most early Englishmen been confined to the lake of fire, chased around eternally by red men carrying spears? In other words, if Indians were damned to hell, we're down there, we're waiting for you. Enslavement before Plymouth takes place. In 1605, we have an early recording that Captain George Weymouth took 5 native people back to England as captives. This continued and continued before the landing of Plymouth. Here's another piece. 1614, Sachem Ipanow and 29 soldiers of Massasoit were captured at Chappaquiddick by Thomas Hunt and were shipped to London and sold to the Spanish. We know that in 1617, a widespread of the bubonic plague massively reduced the Indian populations of southern New England by as much as half before the Pilgrims even landed on Plymouth Rock. They virtually met no resistance. And then in 1633 and 34, the smallpox virus started an epidemic wiping out 90% of the native populations. John Winthrop, governor of Massachusetts Bay, claims that the plague was miraculous. Here's another beautiful photo of Penny Gamble Williams, Chappaquiddick. She runs Talking Feather Radio in Washington, D.C. She celebrates all of her white, black, red ancestry. Raymond Brooks, I love this piece, on Narragansett. Language and culture are learned behavior in human beings. He's clearly stating culture is not biological. We are our ancestors. We have their genetic memory and spirit instilled in us. We are interconnected with that inside of us. Our people were forced to learn English and adopt Western ways, as many indigenous nations were conquered by the Europeans. That does not take away from who we are and who we will stay. In that sense, we are not conquered, but conquerors. What Cheroenhaka? Now we're going to start getting into the settlement of Rhode Island. In 1636, the tiny settlement of Providence was established by Roger Williams, a seeker of Christianity, at the cross paths of Wampanoag and Narragansett trails on either side of the Great Bay in Rhode Island. He writes a book akin to his language as a friend to the native people. He still used words like barbarians and savages when referring to them. In other words, if Roger Williams wrote this beautiful phrase book and knew the word Neetop meaning friend, which is in our state seal, okay? What's your Neetop? We all know that. He still referred to us as barbarians and savages. That led me to think there's a contradiction in what this man was going to do. He eventually would use that book not only for the use of trade, but for later exploitation of Indian peoples. Karen Salvucci, Wampanoag. I want to learn not just from my Wampanoag family, but from any Native person who is willing to teach and help me understand the history and culture of my ancestors. Discovering I am Wampanoag has filled a void in my life and has brought me back home to my tribal family. In the name of war, we're looking at the two big wars here in this region, the Pequot War of 1636-1637, fought in Connecticut backyards that people really don't know much about, especially the part in which Roger Williams approaches Governor Winthrop and tells them how to kill the Pequots by burning their fortification at night. So in the 1637 massacre, Massachusetts Bay Governor John Winthrop would proclaim a day of Thanksgiving kept in all the churches for our victories against the Pequots. So already the Thanksgiving holiday, was not built upon, gee, let's love our family and let's be happy about the bounty that we have received. It was built on the massacre of killing and exterminating the Pequots. This is St. Clair Brinky Tucker, who is a Bermuda Pequot. He writes, most of the Pequots were sold to landowners on St. George's Island and St. David's Island. These two islands are a part of Bermuda and are situated at the eastern end of Bermuda. The British also enslaved Negroes from Africa and white people from Scotland on these two islands. My mother and her ancestors were born on these two islands and can trace their ancestry to the early 17th century. These islands are about a mile apart. My father, from another part of Bermuda, who was also mixed. It was very obvious when looking at ourselves and our relatives, our family gatherings, we all had white and Negro ancestry, but my mother always instilled in her children, her 4 boys, from an early age, their Native American heritage and stressed strongly to be proud of it. 1638, first Negroes arrive. John Winthrop's journal also notes the earliest recorded account of Negro trafficking in colonial New England. On a return trip from Boston, Captain William Pierce, who piloted the slave ship Desire, the first slave ship to start the trade, led Massachusetts to economic independence, had gone to Providence and Tortugas in the West Indies with a cargo including Pequot combatants captured in the Pequot War and to be sold as slaves. According to John Winthrop, Pierce brought back salt, cotton, tobacco, and Negroes. Some anthropologists assert that the arrival of African slaves would help assure the survival of some Indian communities into the 21st century, while also setting the stage for some racial tension today. So here we are, Rhode Island founded in 1636, first Negroes arrive in 1638. Well, already with Roger Williams here, he is here during the engagement of the Pequot War. He knows what's going on, he strategizes, or I should say informs Winthrop of how to strategize and kill the Pequots. And just 2 years later, 1638, Africans arriving. So Rhode Island was in fact a plantation to be worked. Lorraine Baker uses some strong language. Being an Indian in New England is like being a nigger in Beverly Hills. Not a good thing. Most people in New England believe that Indians should look like Hollywood extras. Our race and way of being was wiped out in a few years due to diseases, war, and enslavement. Any Indians left were bred with black slaves. Today, many Indians have curly hair and dark skin. Everywhere I go, I hear the phrase, "You're not Indians, just niggers trying to pass." This is very sad because so many don't know the true history of our people. And so now we're confronted with this mixed race problem. Many multiracial individuals are sometimes viewed as half-breeds. By this logic, could be expected to behave in half-civilized or partially assimilated ways while trying to retain one half of their traditional culture, accounting for their marginalized status in both societies. Being a member of multiple races can add to the internal and external turmoil. Trying to decide whether to choose one race over the other can be very disheartening. Alienation and identity confusion, as well as being seen as less human, can affect perceptions of self and others regarding a single race. And because America has no special technique for handling mixed races, the black-white binary, you're either black or white, has become the accepted model or pattern for mixed race solutions. Again, the census, you're either white or you're not. Here are the Eastern Medicine Singers that you had just seen, and you can see that they are truly a rainbow people. Then we have the Wachunut Band of the Narragansett Indians again. The mixed race problem goes on. Lorraine says, I don't fit into society, never did. I'm not accepted by white nor black peoples. I am very alone racially. There are not many functions in Florida for Indian people. Most are round eyes trying to be Indian. I don't bother with them. No one understands me ethnically, not my white husband or my white friends. They have never been discriminated against and never will be. I can hate them sometimes. It is sad, but true. I have lost my soul. I don't know where it is. And if I had one, I don't know where it went. So you can see some people really struggle with this issue. But back in Arizona, I have a friend named Mike, where he calls himself a social architect. He's triracial, and basically he says, I'll be whatever I need to be in order to fit in. So here we are with the King's Philip's War, which broke out in June 24, and the war continued to sweep across the region and onto Rhode Island, Providence, Cranston, Warwick. They were all attacked, including Roger Williams' house and papers. Many towns were burned: Taunton, Middletown, Brookfield, Deerfield, Northampton, Springfield, Groton, 16 houses in Plymouth, and on and on and on. Basically, this was the most bloodiest war until that time. And there we have the torching of probably downtown Providence. The King Philip's War continues. Colonists decide to make a punitive strike against the neutral Narragansetts for fear of uprisings. A culminating event was on December 19th, 1675, during the Great Swamp Massacre, when 700 Narragansetts, mostly men, women, and children, were killed in North Kingstown. 1,500 soldiers from Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth Colony, and Connecticut, led by General Winslow. It's just kind of ironic that here are the Narragansetts who befriended Roger Williams, gave him a tract of land, and now let's go fry them. What happened? Again, contradiction in the language. You're my friend, you're a savage. English losses were 93, and some 500 Indians were killed or captured for sale and sold as slaves for exportation to the Caribbean, Spain, Portugal, in some cases Africa, to refill coffers drained by military costs. And there's the Great Swamp. Then there's the death of King Philip. Later, under the authority of Governor Josiah Winslow of Plymouth, 1,000 men attacked a defending force of 2,000 Narragansetts in their palisade fort at Mount Hope. And on August 12, 1676, Philip fled to the Murray Swamp, where he was assassinated by one of Captain Benjamin Church's Indian Rangers, John Alderman. Upon inspection of Philip's body, Church is quoted as saying, "A doleful, great, naked, dirty beast." And then Philip was butchered in the manner standard with English punishment. His head was left on a pike for 20 years at Plymouth, and his hand was nailed up in Boston. The King Philip's War was officially over. So again, you have these two major wars fought in this region, right in your own backyard, and nobody knows what happened. Nobody knows what happened to the Indians after the fact. Well, I hope now that you understand they were sold off into slavery. Denis has it. I know who I am. I have the blood of kings and queens running through my veins. And then Roger Williams, who founded the First Baptist Church in the USA, claimed the leading post of justifiabilities of slavery in Rhode Island by selling Narragansett prisoners of war. Now, a town meeting was held in Providence, August 14, 2 days after the killing of Philip, before Thomas Field's house under a tree by the waterside, probably the east side of South Main Street, nearly opposite Crawford Street. And so the town was full of Indian prisoners, and slavery was regarded as a fit punishment for crime. Roger Williams received 32 shilling for his activity. Some Indians were sold for bushels of corn and 3 fat sheep. And if you really want to get a perspective as to where that happened, if you go to Providence, Water Street, and South Main Street, somewhere around the Hemingway restaurant, all right, in the little Roger Williams little park, national park there, is where Williams had exported slaves out of the area. Now, I may be jumping the horse here a little bit, but understand, I've been engaged with DOT in creating 2 slave plaques for downtown Providence. When I wrote the article about Roger Williams, I took a lot of heat. How dare you? You know, he's this golden iconic figure. He's, you know, he's the creme de la creme in Rhode Island and so forth. But, you know, he too was engaged in the slave trade. And so this history needs to be clarified, because when I talk about black Indians in southern New England in classrooms, there needs to be some kind of marker above and beyond just me saying this. And there is a quote in the early town records, which I just showed you, volume 15, that says he was engaged in the trade. Also, he writes a letter to Winthrop after the Pequot War, stating, "I want a little Pequot boy," meaning after the war, Williams himself had a slave. They were shipped off on the Seaflower, and on August 25th, in 1675, Williams caused the drum to be in order the execution of Narragansett Indian Chuff. They considered him to be surly against the English, and Chuff was shot in downtown Providence, somewhere in and around that site as well. And the killing of Chuff gave great satisfaction to the town. And so from there, the Narragansett captives were deported, sent to Boston Harbor, and sailed to the Caribbean with its cargo hold full of 200 heathen malefactors, men, women, and children sentenced to slavery. Carol Brown Meadow says, "I remember when her kindergarten teacher invited an Indian to come to class to help celebrate Thanksgiving holiday. Brown recalls the Indian was a white man dressed in feathers. Brown responded by raising her hand and saying, 'I'm an Indian.' 'No, you're not. All the Indians are dead,' said her teacher. I was so frustrated. I went home to tell my father, and he told me, 'Someday everybody else will know.' Well, I'm telling them, Carol, for you." Slavery finally was abolished in 1652, but the manufacture of rum was just too compelling, and so the need for more slaves and the more manufacture of rum was just necessary. Slavery was abolished again in 1783 by Moses Brown and other Quakers. Finally, the General Assembly of Rhode Island passed the Gradual Emancipation Act, March 1st, 1784. Understand, slavery didn't end until 1880. Even though Moses Brown was instrumental in becoming an abolitionist, he was still tied to Slater Mill. Slater Mill was still producing Negro cloth or nigger cloth to clothe slaves. So he was still somehow engaged through the back door, and that's not talked about. So even deep into the 19th century, slave shippers were still heavily engaged. For example, the U.S. and African Squadron under the command of Perry did very little to stop the slave shipping of Americans and of the Americas, and he was married into the DeWolf slave trading family. And the second Nav also was a slave-holding Southerner. And so in 1663, English King Charles II granted a royal charter, joining all settlements in a colony called the Colony of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. The name stuck, still sticks. Rhode Island used that royal charter as its governing document until 1843. So if Roger Williams was a friend to the Indians, what did he do to stop the war crime? Nothing. And with this type of enlightenment, it's not a matter of you against us, but it's trying to untangle this incredible mess and trying to understand each other. So hopefully at this point, we know once social change begins, it can't be reversed. You cannot uneducate the person who has learned to read. You cannot humiliate the person who feels pride. You cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore. We have seen the future, and the future is ours. So I want to thank all of you for participating. I know this has been a very fast presentation, but I'm held to a really tight clock. If you want to talk to me afterwards, if you want a copy of this PowerPoint presentation, please come see me. Thank you.
Thank you, Julianne. At the end, just so that you know, that any questions that you have for each of these presenters, there's going to be a question and answer period at the end. Our next presenter is Paulla Dove Jennings, daughter of the last traditional Niantic-Narragansett war chief, Roaring Bull, and Pretty Flower. She is a mother, a grandmother, and a great-grandmother. Paulla is of the Turtle Clan of the Narragansett Niantic people. The Turtle Clan are the holders of the clan history and the stories. She attended CCRI and URI, interned at the Boston Children's Museum. She was part of Leadership Rhode Island, and she took courses at Falmouth College in administration and finance and grant writing. She is the former Narragansett tribal administrator. She also served her community on tribal council for many years and served on the Narragansett Economic and Gaming Commissions. She was the director of the youth programs at the Rhode Island Indian Council, the executive director of the Rhode Island Commission for Indian Affairs, and the curator of study storage at the Boston Children's Museum, and the curator and board chairwoman at Tomaquag Indian Memorial Museum. Over 20 years ago, she authored the book Strawberry Thanksgiving, published by Simon & Schuster. After debating various editors, she decided to become an oral historian and tell her own story without the influence of the editors. She has told stories of her people, the Niantic and Narragansett, from Alaska to Maine. As an oral historian, she has lectured at the University of North Dakota, Yale, Tufts, Rhode Island School of Design, Columbia, Jackson State, Brown, University of UMass, at Amherst, the University of New Hampshire, URI, and many other colleges, as well as telling stories to children as young as preschool all the way up to elders in schools, museums, Native cultural centers, and other places across the United States. Her greatest joy is sharing the news to non-Native children. Welcome to our country. And with that, I introduce to you Paulla Dove Jennings.
I thank you, all my relations. My name is Paulla Dove Jennings, and as my niece told you, I am the daughter of Chief Roaring Bull, who was the last traditional Narragansett Indian war chief in our nation. And he married my mother, who is Pretty Flower, and she's as beautiful today at 92 as she was when she first pointed out to my dad and said, "I'll take the tall one." I was given my Indian name, Sunflower, by Chief Stronghorse, and so this is to honor him. I'm going to say 7 words: race, hate, class, integration, segregation, traits, racially pure, and slaves. We didn't have any of those words in the Niantic or Narragansett language. When I was asked to do a presentation here today, I said, there's a lot of things that I could talk about. There's a lot of things that interest me, the history of not only here in the East, but the people, and national history. So now if you've got a pen or a pencil or a friend that has one, did my research. The first book that I want to introduce you to is The History of White People. And it's by a woman named Nell Irvin Painter. And she was a professor at Princeton. I wanted to know how race came to be. And it started over in Europe, when one community considered racism against another community. They weren't as pure. So I read this book, and it's yellow highlights all the way through it because there's a lot of academia in it. And I wanted to get to the meat of the subject. So if you've got that book, when I finished it, I said, I've got to read something else. And my family can tell you I must have a library of several hundred books. And I looked for some books that I had picked up years ago and never had the time to read. And when I read this particular book, The Wolf at Twilight, by Kent Nerburn, Nerburn, even though he was Lakota, the stories are the same all over. You'll hear about being sent away from your family, taken, stolen, and sent to schools to take the Indian out of you. That's a hateful thing, but it happened. There are also some dates that you should be aware of, and I don't have them in any particular order. I just have them as they interest me. In 1978, the United States government declared the Native American Religious Freedom Act. We could not practice our religion legally until 1978. And this was after my people had received the land returned to them, the small parcel of land in Charlestown. And what didn't happen is we didn't have a spot on the ocean. And that's where many of our prayers and ceremonies take place, because the ocean itself is made biologically, chemically, the same as the water that holds a baby in a mother's stomach. That is our mother. It feeds us, does all kinds of things for us, but we did not have that freedom. We did not become citizens in this country, on our land, even if it was taken away from us. It's still ours. I'll tell each and every one of you, you're sitting in a building that's on my land. We weren't considered native citizens. Now, we fought, the Narragansetts fought in the Civil War. We battled for the black people. And when the war was over, the state of Rhode Island sent representatives to us and said, we want to give you your rights. You can become citizens. And they talked to us and talked to us. And the elders, who were wise, because non-Indians always go to the males, not realizing that it's the women that had the power and the glory. They came to the women and said, what do you think about this? And we thought long and hard about it, and what we decided was, we see the freedom they've given to the black man. It's not true freedom. Why, we don't ever think that we will see a black man in a position of power. And I wept when Obama won. So we refused it. We didn't become citizens until 1924. We weren't allowed to vote, even though every other nation, tribe was allowed to vote. In Rhode Island, they didn't allow us to vote until the year 1950. My father always says voting is a responsibility and a privilege. Listen to what is being said and vote wisely. Now we're going to go back a while to 1830. The United States government set up a peace policy. And that peace policy was, instead of killing the Indians, assimilate them. And that's when our children were stolen and sent to boarding schools. Their hair had cut off. They were forbidden to speak their language. They couldn't say their prayers. They could seldom go home. Some, they were sold to other people as servants. And even though I'm talking about the year 1830, I have a brother-in-law who's Choctaw. And he's in his early 50s. He was taken away, and his sister was taken away from his mother and sent to a boarding school. At that time, they lived in Chicago, Illinois. And they were sent to a boarding school. If I remember correctly, it was Oklahoma. And he was beaten for speaking his language. And when I met him, he was a young man, married to my sister, going to college. And he took off his shirt one day. We were going swimming, and the marks are still on his back. In 1966, the Civil Rights Act was passed for Native people. My husband was from Mississippi. He had just got out of the Air Force, been stationed in England for several years, and I met him here in Rhode Island. Eventually we married, and we moved to Mississippi. My husband looked like a white man, but he was Indian, and he was white. And in the town he lived in, he was considered black, and he was shot 3 times by the Ku Klux Klan. He was saved when I called from the hospital, called my parents in Rhode Island, and my mother said, get the doctor to get an okay, and we'll put him on a plane. The doctors would not see me. Finally, I'm talking on the phone, and everybody's hearing me, and one of my uncles says, I'll call Bobby Kennedy. Then I was allowed to put him in a proper hospital, and he got well. Then in 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act came into being. Because even up to that time, if a child was taken away from his parents, he wasn't put with Native people, it's with anybody else. So now we have laws that help protect us and protect our young people. In 1988, Ronald Reagan said, Self-Determination Act, which affects my people, the Narragansett, and other people from other tribes here in this area. Nothing in this act shall be construed as affecting, modifying, diminishing, or otherwise impairing the sovereign immunity from suit enjoyed by an Indian tribe, or authorizing or requiring the termination of any existing trust responsibility of the United States to Indian people. And it's actually signed by Ronald Reagan and the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Now these are laws that were written saying that we're going to have the same freedom, we're going to have the same rights, we're going to have all of the things that, not only the responsibility, but also the rights that Native people should rightly have. I want to go back about probably 25 or 30 years. Some of you, maybe all of you, maybe most of you will remember Ellison Tarzan Brown. Ran in the marathon, ran the Boston Marathon twice and won it. One year he ran in upstate New York, won the marathon, hitched a ride to Boston, borrowed the entry fee, and won that day also. He also went to Berlin and to the Olympics, and I'm honored to say, just like Jesse Owens, he was snubbed by Hitler. He was run over by a man in the parking lot in Westerly, down at Watch Hill, Quannacontog, Misquamicut, somewhere down there. The person not only ran over him once, which might be a mistake, they ran over him twice, and he was dead. And the day of his funeral, when they were getting ready to inter them, the Attorney General's office took his body then to examine it. Of course, nothing, not even a ticket, went to the man that killed Ellison Tarzan Brown, my cousin. Next, I want to speak about Melvin Coombs. Melvin Coombs was a storyteller, a dancer, a Wampanoag from Mashpee who had a joy for life and living. He liked hunting, he liked fishing, he was proud of his culture. He fed birds in the birdhouses, and you would see him out there getting ready to pour corn in the birdhouse, and all of a sudden music would come inside his body, and you'd see him stoop and he'd start to dance. He loved children. He taught them how to fish. He taught them how to garden. And one night, he was hit, the coroner said, by a blunt force instrument. Took 5 days to find him, and he wouldn't have been found, but my sister, who was his girlfriend, and my younger sister kept saying, we know he's in this area. We know he's in this area. My brother and his wife went out and they found his cap. Finally, the state police came there. They had been looking, but my family sensed where he was at. He was hidden on this man's property on an old piece of metal. Terrific, horrific court dates went through. Mashpee, Pequot, Narragansett, Nipmuc, Scattercook, all the local people went to the courthouse. And nothing happened to that man. They killed Melvin Coombs. So we have justice here in Rhode Island. And then we come to a more recent event. The infamous smoke shop. I was on the Economic Development Committee. We researched other tribal members who had been on the committee previous years, tried to do due diligence on whether it was worth doing and what our rights were. And we researched and we saw what the federal government said was our rights as a people. And we went to upstate New York and we made arrangements to open the smoke shop. All the while, the governor and the chief are talking to each other. The governor is out of town, but they're talking. And because I was on the commission, I was there on Friday, helping stock up. On Saturday, when all the elders came and they had come in, and we were only selling cartons of cigarettes, not packages. Cartons of cigarettes, and they'd come in and buy whatever the cheapest brand was. They were so proud. We finally had something we could make a little money off of. And they all wanted to sit out in the parking lot. Same thing happened on Sunday. The media was there. Every station was there. And then on Monday morning, I said, Chief, nothing happened over the weekend. If something happens, what do I do? What do I tell the staff to do? He said, well, if they come with a federal court order, because we are under the federal government, that's what the law says. You close up shop, you do exactly what they tell you to do. And we said, okay. And I went to our tribal police, who were all trained as policemen. They actually are real policemen, not playing. They didn't play it being Indian and not playing it being policemen. I said, could you please ask the elders and the women and the children not to park in the parking lot, because we have so many people come in, the buyers don't have room. I know they're proud, I know they're happy, but please ask them, go over to the health center, go up to administration, go someplace else. Go up to the elders building. Then we found out, not on Monday, when the chief talked to the governor says, I'm having a writ for them to come in and close the shop down. They're going into court today. So we're thinking, okay, tomorrow we'll see what comes. But instead, he filed the writ on Friday before we even opened. And in a state court, not in a federal court. And they came and they invaded and they beat, and one young woman lost a child. My son got his leg broken. We went to various courts for various things over the year. A lot of schools got a lot of free programs because the chief and the first councilman had to go so many hours to various local schools and talk about Native culture. My son, whose leg was broken by the state police and told by the state police, don't worry, we'll take care of this. Don't worry about the bill. Went to the ambulance, got his leg taken care of, what they had to do. He had to go to his own doctor the next day. We get a phone call the next day as I'm getting ready to take him to his own doctor. And this man on the phone says, by the way, Adam Jennings, you're under arrest. For what? Why? I'm the one with the broken ankle. Time went on and we ended up in court. We went to court. My son was found innocent. Not once, not twice, but 3 times, in another court, a 4th time. And he was awarded a small sum of money, $300,000. And the judge, in his wisdom, because he wasn't racist, because we don't know that word, he wasn't anti-Narragansett, decided he didn't deserve it. So we had to go to court up in Boston, and they affirmed the decision that we should have it. Then we had to go to another court. Anyhow, my son didn't receive a dime. Cold weather, dampness, he still limps. But you know what? He's still in Narragansett, and everybody's still here in our country, Narragansett land. I love you all. People, all people, are the greatest. If you came to dinner at my family's house on Thanksgiving or Easter or Christmas or any of those days, you will see the whole League of Nations, because that's what we are. Some of you, and maybe even more than what I know out here, may be a relative of mine. Doesn't matter what your race is. I've decided I'm not going to use that word again after today. I suggest you do the same. I thank you.
Next, there's going to be the film Sovereign Neighbor, Sovereign Nation that reflects on what Paulla was just talking about.
Am I blocking anybody? I feel.
Should we scooch out of the way?
No? Okay.
While she's getting it ready, I do want to say, I'd be remiss to say that it's by Kendall Moore, URI professor, and you should know that.
I don't think that we've ever aspired for complete and total autonomy. It's just that when it comes to the business sense, the religious things that happen within our nation, that's our business. That's not anybody else's business. And I see no need to have Great White Father come in and tell us how to do this.
The controversial Narragansett Smoke Shop opened its doors Saturday at noon, and 24 hours later, its shelves are almost empty. 7 weeks ago, the tribe postponed opening the shop at Governor Kachiri's request. But talks with the Rhode Island Economic Development Corporation have stalled, and tribal members feel as if their backs are against the wall. Meanwhile, the governor provided this statement regarding the opening of the smoke shop. The Attorney General's office is planning to go to court on Monday morning to seek an injunction against the continued illegal sale of tobacco products by the Narragansett Indian tribe.
Excuse me, if you block us, you're going to be around. No, wait a minute.
Even conservative folks, people who are kind of politically conservative, were saying that's not right, that's not how we treat our neighbors. It was a flash from 1963 or 64, right out of the civil rights era, when people would stick attack dogs and fire hoses on people. Wants to hold on to, well, we made this agreement with this in the Land Claim Settlement Act with this tribal entity. And generally the federal government and the tribe is saying, that's nice, and that was an agreement, but that was not with the federally recognized tribe called the Narragansetts. Two different things. And so the tribe now has this status, so this document doesn't mean anything.
We do not fall under that auspices any longer. We are a sovereign nation.
We're a nation within a nation. We have our own bylaws. We have our own police department. We have our own community. And it's tough to live in society with you being a nation within a nation.
It's beyond reach for them to accept that there can be a sovereign nation that predated the history of the country and the establishment of this little state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, that how can this entity exist as a government when it's just a bunch of folks of color? And in Rhode Island, they'd say, and half of you don't look like natives anyhow. So there's this real disconnect, kind of psychologically. That's kind of the nice version. The not nice version is that it's just flat out racism.
To have these people come down here with dogs, it looks like something out of Mississippi in the damn 60s. What the hell's the matter with these people? There's kids in here. He's a minor. There's kids.
I would die for my tribe, Chief.
I'm sorry, what are you saying there?
I was...
Sovereignty means that we can live our life to the best of our ability, sharing and doing for one another without putting a burden on anyone else. And by selling cigarettes, which was our right as a sovereign nation, we weren't hurting anyone.
What would it mean to the larger community if the tribe was self-sufficient. There's something scary in it for majority folks, and I don't know what it is. The only way to solve problems, to achieve reconciliation, to understand each other is through real, honest, well-intentioned dialogue. And that's not the dialogue that happens with lawyers in the room. It's not the dialogue that happens, at the State House. It's the dialogue that happens when small groups of people get together to actually find out who each other are. And then all of the misconceptions can kind of be dispelled. Our next speaker is Wanda Jean Lord, and she is descendant from Cherokee Choctaw from Oklahoma. She is the founder of HOOP, Honoring Our Own Power, in 1998. Her education includes studies at Native American Education Services College, Chicago, and at Masters of Community Economic Development program at Southern New Hampshire University. She has led business development, content strategy, and project management for international and Native-owned technology firms. She has developed business and grant strategies resulting in increased revenues from $400,000 per year to over $13 million per year for tribes, Native American foundations, or other Native-focused businesses. While leading a national foundation's work towards strengthening Native American philanthropy, she developed a first-of-its-kind listserv for Native nonprofits in 2000, a national conference series bringing mainstream foundations and tribal nations together called The Wisdom of the Giveaway in 2001. She has worked at the national level at the National Indian Gaming Association, the National Indian Business Association, and has been requested to design and to present workshops at the National Gathering of the Native Americans in Philanthropy and the National Indian Gaming Association. Her work is cited by tribes, universities, foundations, and Native nonprofits. She founded the website 3hoops.com, which facilitated over $100,000 in charitable donations to tribes and Indian organizations, and currently works for a tribal nation as their development officer. I'd like to introduce to you Wanda Jean Lord.
Hi. First, I'd just like to thank Lorraine for that introduction and to say that I'm really honored to be here and to share some thoughts with you tonight and to be a part of this panel with Julianne and with Paulla Jennings. In thinking about what I might say tonight, I also had a sense that the conversation, although the topic is race, really might not focus so much on racism, but might focus also on why do people make the choices that they make. And so this PowerPoint is kind of going to talk to that thought. I started with the thought that there's only one Earth. We all share it. and we only have one, and she supports us all. And that there are two ways of looking at the earth. Once I heard a native gentleman, talk about the difference between saying the word earth and saying the word dirt. And that when you say the word earth, you're talking about what gives us life, what provides for everything that we have. You're talking about a way of relating to where we come from and who we are. And when you say the word dirt, you can do anything to it. You can dump oil on it, you can dump garbage on it, you can stomp on it. There's no relationship anymore. It's just dirt. And so, kind of going with that thought of 1, 2, and 3, there's one earth. There's two ways of approaching things, in a sacred manner or in a profane way, in a disconnected way. And there's 3 times that our choices impact, always. Every choice that I make impacts the way I view my past, the way I live my present, and what I'm preparing for in the future. So, again, there's one choice, really. Do I want to view something in a related way, in a respectful way, in a way that acknowledges another being's beingness? Or do I want to just keep it objectified? And what does that do to me? And what does that do to how I treat my choice? So there is one earth. There is one you. There's only one choice to be made at a time. And you can't get out of it, because not making a choice is making a choice too. So the question is, how do we treat the earth and those upon her? So we can look at this, and what I did in thinking this through was kind of look at a time frame and say, okay, what we're really talking about is a time frame of looking at things in an object-based way, an objectified way, and in a profane way. And one thing that's interesting to me is that if we look at most Native peoples that I've dealt with, most communities say that they have always been here. And on a scientific, documented way, usually the minimum amount of time that Native communities have been documented as living here on the North American continent is 10,000 to 12,000 years. And that made me think of the 400 years or so that we're talking about now. So if that 10,000 years was a day, if it equaled 24 hours, what we're talking about is what has happened in the last 15 minutes. So we're here to talk about race, and there are 4 races on the planet. There's 4 races on the earth: white, red, yellow, and black. And in thinking about this timeline, we have the phrase that everybody knows: in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And in thinking about, was the thought process that came over here a related way of thinking or an objectified way of thinking? You know, I'm a mixed-blooded human being. I'm Cherokee and Choctaw descent from Oklahoma. And I'm also English and Irish. And on the English side, it appears that I descend from some of the first founders of the state of Connecticut, which is it's actually a shame for me in my heart, but it's a fact I can't change. And in looking at what the English people brought over here, they didn't bring over here an idea that was related. They didn't really treat their own people any differently than they treated Indigenous people, and that's a shame. But the truth is, and Julie Jennings' presentation touched on it, that there was only a teeny tiny portion of people over in Europe that might be considered free. Everybody else was a slave equivalent. They were a bondsperson, and they were an object. They were an object to be quantified or used. But this idea of a related way of interacting among people wasn't something that those people lived with, and it wasn't something that they brought over here. So I'm a business analyst. I do a lot of business analyzing, so I'm looking at this really from, okay, what was the economic background that made it make sense to even want to come over this way? And what the economic background was that Columbus was hired under a mercenary contract. He was the equivalent of an international business development, and he was charged with opening a new vertical. He was supposed to find spices, and he was supposed to find gold, and he was supposed to find India, but he didn't find any of those, which really wasn't good for him, because part of his contract included if he didn't perform, he could be put to death. So he needed to find a way to perform. And the way he found to perform was, if you can't sell gold, you can sell people. And that's how the slave trade began in that process. So when we look at it, to me, racism was like a subsidiary output of this process. It was a necessary cost of goods sold if anybody's a business major. And it just happened to be, a secondary process that comes from treating people like objects. So when you treat people like objects, what can you justify doing to them? Well, you can justify taking the way that they think or the way that they behave away from them as much as possible. So that's slavery, torture, certainly. They're objects. They don't have an equal relationship. And you can exterminate them because they're objects. So there's that part. I think the other important thing to look at is that first we're dealing with a mercenary business contract that brought Columbus over here, and then from there we're dealing with other contracts that continue this type of economic development, really, that's based on the objectification of people and of land bases. So then we move forward to 1663 here in Rhode Island, and most people are familiar with the Royal Charter of Rhode Island, at least in that there's a phrase that you hear often in Rhode Island about the lively experiment that Rhode Island was for religious freedom to take place in this state. What you won't hear about, hardly ever actually, is that in that same charter, the legal authority to exterminate Native peoples, including the Narragansetts, who were referenced as friends, was implicit in that charter. The only caveat to that was the state or the colony at the time could not take it upon themselves to exterminate the people outright. They had to check with their neighboring colonies to make sure that it, wouldn't muck up the works on those lands. And so we've got, and slavery has been touched on here. I think, to me, the idea of torture, in terms of the betrayal that took place, Roger Williams was banished to what is now Rhode Island and would not have survived had it not been for decades of assistance that he received from the Narragansett people. He wouldn't have ever made it to 1663. He would have never made it to be able to obtain the charter that founded this state. And his repayment was to sell the relatives of the people that helped him into slavery. And to me, that's a mental torture. And extermination and assimilation we've already talked about. So in following this idea, and really to me this is about, okay, we have a mercenary contract, then we have the use of charters, and next we have the use of treaties. Okay, but they're all really contracts. That's what we're talking about here, is contract law and how contract law can be used to sustain unjust practices. So in pre-1776, the Royal Charter authorizes slavery or extermination of Indigenous people in Rhode Island. In post-1776, many of the states, the former colonies, did have some treaties in place with various tribes. Maine, Rhode Island, Virginia, all conveniently decided just simply not to honor the previous treaties that they had with the Indigenous communities within their borders. Oh. And sometimes people will also say, well, what's the big deal? Why are Native people making such a big deal over things like sports mascots or that type of thing? We have the Washington Redskins. And I think that many people don't know where the term Redskin came from. The term Redskin came from George Washington's troops skinning Native American people and sewing their skins together to make coverings for their boots so they wouldn't be so badly damaged by snow or rain. So the skins were red with blood, and they tended to dry a red tone. And that's where the term Redskins comes from. And that's why it's offensive as a mascot to many Native peoples. And so, again, after 1776, slavery continues if it's practical among the states. Extermination continues if it's practical and agreed to on a state or interstate basis. And then there became assimilation as a tactic of dealing with the Indian problem. Education was a first choice, and many people don't know that Harvard was founded for the education of Indian people. And was funded really nicely to do that. Intermarriage began to have some impacts and some unwanted impacts from a mainstream point of view, in that whites were intermarrying into tribal nations and were assimilating into the tribal nations as opposed to bringing their native spouses to mainstream society. And this became a problem if you were looking at, if you had a goal, consider again this economic development, business development tangent. If your goal was to amass a greater land base, and that land base is already occupied and therefore is an impediment to you obtaining your goal, if that population increases dramatically, it's going to be more of a problem to get the land. So intermarriage was a difficulty in terms of being able to remove Indigenous people from their lands. Moving forward, we come to the 1820s, and in 1828 actually, and this goes back to the history of the tribal nation from which I'm descended, the Cherokee Nation's original homelands were from Virginia to West Virginia down to Tennessee, Georgia, North Carolina. And in 1828, a tacit secret agreement was made by the governor of Georgia and the federal government to agree that when the state of Georgia moved forward to, quote, extirpate the perfidious Indians among our midst, end quote, that the federal government would support the state of Georgia. In 1829, gold was discovered in the state of Georgia, and so it became imperative from Georgia's perspective to remove the Cherokee Nation from within the state of Georgia. At the time, the Cherokee Nation was the wealthiest nation, mainstream or native, on the continent. And so how could Georgia get rid of these folks? Well, what was done was before where we had either a mercenary contract, a charter, or a treaty, now new laws were created. And the laws that were created provided for three things. The first law provided that every white citizen of Georgia had to swear allegiance to all of Georgia's laws or be imprisoned for 7 years. The second law provided that no American Indian person could bring suit to a Georgia court. The third law provided that the only way a Native American person could be heard in a Georgia court was if two white people stood on their behalf. Now, for those white people to do that, they would be risking 7 years imprisonment. So very few, it's not to say none, a handful did stand up and a handful were imprisoned for 7 years. But very few people stood up. So what did that mean in fact? What that meant in fact was that if I were a white person, I walked into any of your houses and you all were Cherokee, I could say to you, you're now my slave. I could kill your family members or just enslave them. I could take your home, I could take your business, I could take all of your possessions, and you had no legal recourse. And I think this is an important thing to think about, not only for what happened a little bit over 100 years ago, but for the idea of Native peoples being intimidated away from the use of legal protections that every other peoples can depend upon. And I'd like you to consider that thought as we move forward on this timeline. So that process was very effective. It resulted in the Trail of Tears, and there was one other point that had to be made, one other I that needed to be dotted, and that was this problem of intermarriage. So the way that this was dealt with was the creation of blood quantum laws. And the blood quantum laws in dealing with the Cherokee Nation and tribes afterwards were aimed at limiting population growth. So you couldn't stop people from marrying outside, marrying non-native people, and you couldn't stop these couples from having babies, and this was a population explosion that was a problem. So what could you do? You could create a blood quantum system, and that blood quantum system at that time said that if you were less than 1/4 Cherokee or Native American, that you were no longer a citizen of your community. You were no longer Indian. I actually do some work in Washington, D.C. on occasion, and I happened to be talking with a friend of mine who was 100% Indian, but he was of two tribes, and he had married another woman who was 100% Indian. She was of two different tribes, and so they had babies, and those babies were quarter blood, but all native admixtures. So that meant that those babies could still register in one of the father's tribes, could still enroll in one of the father's tribes. One of their children married another person who was also 100% Indian, but of 4 different tribal nations, not the same as hers. That baby was no longer Indian. So blood quantum is a complex issue. What the blood quantum and the use of these types of laws did was provide the models for other people to deal with their ethnic problems, especially when dealing with those ethnic problems would result in greater asset bases for the mainstream society. So you see Jim Crow laws were a direct outcome of the blood quantum laws. Hitler studied the United States treatment of its Indian problem in order for him to develop models of dealing with his Jewish problem. And this was also the basis for the apartheid laws that were practiced in South Africa. Post-1850, the slavery of Indians continues. Many people think that slavery in this country ended in 1865, and that's true for African American people. But in the case of California, for instance, what really happened was as the states moved along, they got smarter in their use of best practice models. So this idea of enslavement first, if you could, because that was the best economic use of people as objects. Extermination, as a viable second option, or assimilation were consistent from the east to the west. And by the time the states were being created in the western part of this country, it had gotten down to a pretty good science. The first two laws that were created by the state of California in 1849 were for the care and protection of Indians. The first law provided a fund of $1 million in 1849 to be paid out at 5 cents to $5 per head of Indian people brought in. So any white settler could make a good living and bringing in heads of Indian people, and that's why you see Indian head nickels or pennies from that period of time. The second law had to do with enslavement. If extermination wasn't really the way you wanted to make your living in 1849, the second law provided that any white person who came upon any Indian person not already actively employed by another white person could take that person into bondage, into slavery, for 7-year periods recurring. And that practice continued until the early 1900s in California. So, and someone had mentioned a little bit about the boarding schools. Paulla had mentioned about the boarding schools and ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act. What I'm really grateful for is that now, even though Native American communities, tribal communities are eligible for far less often than 1/3 of the funding that any other community can depend on to serve the needs of its members, that there is some funding available to begin to protect Indian children from being ripped from their homes. In post-1850, the unwanted intermarriage impacts were addressed by the instituting blood quantum and allegiance laws to states. And what we begin to see here is that in addition to the use of charter and treaty processes, that the Supreme Court becomes a useful vehicle in reducing tribal rights. So really, if you've got the right kind of Supreme Court and you're interested in reducing tribal rights or obtaining tribal assets, all you have to do is get the case up to the Supreme Court and get the proper ruling. So next we get to the 1910s, 1920s. Native Americans served in World War II, and there tended to be a swing towards a positive sense of, well, we want to stop the predations on Indian lands. And so in 1934, as a result of that positive feeling, the Howard Wheeler, or the Indian Reorganization Act, was put in place. And basically, in a nutshell, what that law did was tell states enough. No more predatory behavior towards tribes, no more land grabs, enough. And if the tribes have a federally recognized relationship, they have the ability to put their lands in trust. That means the feds are holding these lands in trust and protecting the lands from the states on behalf of the tribes. And the tribes have the ability to do economic development, housing, whatever they might consider fit use of their lands. In 1950s, the pendulum swung the other way, and there again was a detribalization move in the United States. And so tribes were being unfederally recognized. For me, this matter of federal recognition really boils down to a game of now I see you, now I don't. If I go like this, you don't exist anymore. If I go like that, I recognize you, and now you exist, and you have rights. And if I go like this, you don't exist anymore, because I can't see you. And that essentially is what federal recognition, what the process has been to tribes, and the way it's been used to either affirm or reduce tribal rights. In 1970s, Paula had mentioned this as well, that land settlement acts took place, especially in New England, because especially in New England, there had been many, many, many land grabs against Indian lands, and the states were realizing that they had better negotiate with tribes, because tribes were finally becoming educated enough in the legal constructs to mount significant claims against the states. In the 1980s, and now we come to Rhode Island in particular, and Rhode Island recently, because I think this is the other point that's really important, is that this idea of injustice as it relates to race, as it relates to Indian people, is not an old story. It's an old story, but it's a story that continues today. So in the 1980s, tribes across the nation became protected by the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. And what that meant in a nutshell is if states had the capacity to have gaming, tribes could not be precluded by states from also having the right to develop gaming. And that is true to this day across the nation in every state except this one. And the reason it's not true in this state is that Chafee the Senior put a essentially secret rider into an appropriations bill that designated the Narragansett tribe as the only federally recognized tribe that could not fully access the benefits of IGRA, of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. But Rhode Island didn't stop there. We just saw a film about the smoke shop raid, and really what that question is about is, do tribes have the ability to generate economic development revenues without interference from the state? What we're not taught from kindergarten through the doctoral level is what we're looking at when we're looking at interactions in between tribes and states. I think everybody's seen that little puzzle. Remember the little puzzle when you were 5 years old and it had all the states? It was a wooden puzzle and you could put California in and you could put, right? I see some people shaking their heads. And so we clearly got the message that the United States equals what? The United States equals 50 states. You can put them all in that puzzle. You see where they are. And that's true, but it's only 1/3 of the entire accurate equation. On a pure basis, the United States equals 50 states plus 6 territories plus 564 federally recognized tribes. And just the same as Rhode Island has no business legislating whether or not New Hampshire sells its liquor tax-free, it has no business legislating whether or not the Narragansett sold cigarettes tax-free or whether or not there's a casino in Puerto Rico. They're all equally ludicrous decisions for this state to be involved in. But because people are not taught what they're looking at, they don't know how to assess what they're seeing going on in front of them. So in 2000, Rhode Island led, as we saw, a literal physical attack on tribal people in the smoke shop raid. And since 2005, there has not been a pro-tribal decision from the Supreme Court on any case brought to the Supreme Court that had a tribal issue involved. And I don't believe that that knowledge was lost upon the state of Rhode Island as it moved this process through the appeals court, or as it began the initial attack that caused the incident to go to court. In 2009, Rhode Island led 21 states in seeking to reverse all tribes' abilities, and when we look back up at the 1934 Howard Wheeler Act, to reverse all tribes' abilities, not just Narragansetts, to provide for their people under the protections of the Howard Wheeler Act. And what's important about that, though, is that that was 21 states. 29 states did not want to return to the practices of the past. And I think that's an important point to make. Unfortunately, this state wasn't among them. So today, Rhode Island leads in the contemporary Indian wars against the sovereignty of all federally recognized tribal nations in the United States. Rhode Island crafted the Carcieri versus Salazar amicus briefs that were presented in front of the Supreme Court under the lead of the state of Alabama. This was a multi-state strategy designed to use what was going on in this state as a way to hamstring the economic development abilities of tribes across the nation. In 2009, the Supreme Court ruled on a phrase in the Howard Wheeler Act that whether or not the Howard Wheeler Act applied to tribes now federally recognized. So I want you to consider the reasoning, because I think it's very important that we understand what's in front of us. The ruling hinged on the definition of the word now. Is anybody married here? Anybody ever been married? A couple people, right? Okay, so somebody at some point once said to you, I now pronounce you man and wife, right? Most people would understand that to mean from that moment in time forward. Otherwise, we'd have no divorce law, right? Because if it meant only at that very second, and never before and never after, or if it meant only at that very second and ever before, but never after, nobody'd ever need to get divorced, because when somebody said to you, I now pronounce you man and wife, you could be certain you weren't. Right? This is the reasoning that the Supreme Court used on the Carcieri versus Salazar decision. They ruled that the word now meant at that moment in time in 1934 and never after. What does that mean? That means about 200 tribes that have been in this process of now I see you, now I don't, with the federal government, and were recognized. That does not say existed. They always existed, but were recognized after 1934, are impacted by this ruling. And there are things that each one of you can do about this right now, as in the real meaning of now and forward. Each one of you could call your senators or your representatives and you could say, I want a Carcieri-Salazar fix. I want tribes to at least be returned to the full protections intended by the Howard Wheeler Act. Each one of you could do that. So, I think we've pretty much touched on this. The U.S. Supreme Court decisions since 2005 onward have been 100% against all tribes on all issues. So this is, the legal system right now is slanted against tribes. The appeals process is a dangerous place for tribes to go now. And that does still result in at least a psychic, if not an economic, slavery. Imagine if you had no recourse to protect your assets in court because you knew that if you went there, you were pretty likely to get ruled against. What would that do to your sense of safety or your sense to move forward economically if something was in conflict? An extermination, well, the good news is that extermination now doesn't usually generally mean somebody's bringing your head in on a platter, except for figuratively. But the truth is that unless more people than only Native people stand up together and say, we want justice, that this process can be used to exterminate rights bit by bit, bite by bite, suit by suit. And I'm ending this with just two suggestions. The first, again, I'm going to say that if you've felt informed by this presentation, please call your senator, call your representative, and say that you, as a human being and as a Rhode Island resident, support tribal rights. And secondly, if any of this information is new to you, contact your university and ask them to increase the numbers of tribally recommended educators that are presenting information to you. Thanks.
At this time, I know we're running a bit late, but at this time, if you have questions for our panelists, you can do that first. Okay, I'm being told that there's a dancer here from Nassau, and that we're going to pause before the question and answers and let them perform for you. Are they? Darnell? Huh. It's Narragansett, son of one of our council leaders. John Pompey. Oh, it looks like John Pompey's here. His dad, I see. Going to demonstrate for us. Welcome. Kanupiam.
Thank you, Lorraine Spears, for introducing us. I'm Darnell Spencer, president of NASO, Native American Student Organization. What we're going to do now is we're going to do our first song. We're going to do the Calumet. Did you want to talk about it?
How you doing, everyone? Excuse me, I'm not a microphone person.
Speak loud.
I'd like to announce myself. I'm John Pompey, second councilman of Narragansett. I'd like to, first of all, look at this. I'd like to honor one of my elders here. And councilwoman of our tribe. And if I may, I'd like to say a couple of prayers. side so that I can participate. Do you have any other Narragansetts dancers out there who would like to join us? Please come up and join if you like.
want to thank Donnell. Are you the president of Nassau, the president of Native American Student Association? Tosh. And to make things a little easier for you or for our speakers, I'm going to just ask our three speakers to come up to the podium, and as you ask your questions, they'll be nearby the microphone to make things a little bit easier.
We have run a little bit over time for tonight, so I think that the easiest thing to do is if you've got questions and you'd like to speak with any of our guests, there's a number of them to talk with, please just come on up to the stage and have a more intimate dialogue with them before our evening's through. Thank you, everybody.